Let's return to the US now, where the military is only hours away from enforcing a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz after peace talks with Iran failed. But it's not only Iran that US President Donald Trump has lashed out against. He took to social media to criticize Pope Leo after the pontiff called for an end to violence. Julia Manchester is a White House reporter with The Hill and joins me now. Julia, good to have you with us once again. So just a few hours away from President Trump's deadline of imposing his own blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, is there a sense that this will materialize, or is this simply another threat?
Good evening. Yes, there is a sense this will materialize not only in the Strait of Hormuz, but across all Iranian ports across the country. We saw the U.S. military, U.S. CENTCOM announce yesterday that this would happen at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in Iran. That is when the U.S. would begin its blockade. The question is, though, I guess, how long does this last? We are running up to the opening of the markets here in the United States, so it'll be interesting to see if President Trump says anything beforehand to maybe influence or somehow, help stocks rally ahead of this blockade. But this blockade does seem ready to go. It comes ahead of or following those very failed talks in Islamabad between the U.S. and Iran this weekend. So I think what you're looking at is the U.S. and Iran sort of facing off once again, trying to see who blinks first or who can hold out first.
And so what's been the political reaction there in Washington to Trump upping the ante in the Strait, given the pain of rising fuel prices also being felt by Americans?
Well, there's a lot of concern here in Washington, I think, going forward, particularly from Republicans going into an election year. You have the House of Representatives and the Senate up for grabs later this November, and that's something that the Iranians are also very cognizant of. They are cognizant of the pressure President Trump is under politically here in the United States. I thought it was interesting to see Iran's parliamentary speaker say yesterday or post what current gas prices were near the White House and give the, sort of speak directly to Americans and say, enjoy the gas prices now because they're only going to go up with this blockade. And I think there is a concern that that could continue here in the United States, particularly, in an election that has really been predicated on this issue of affordability.
Yes, and can you tell us what are some of the latest polls saying about the midterms, although they are quite some months away?
Well, in terms of the midterms, I would say that Republicans are favored to keep control of the Senate, even though very narrowly. It'll be a very narrow margin. The nonpartisan Cook Political Report, an election forecaster here in the United States, has just moved a number of toss-up races or swing races towards Democrats, so the Senate races in Ohio and North Carolina. That being said, though, Democrats would need to win 4 Senate seats or flip 4 Senate seats to gain control of the upper chamber. That would be sort of a steep uphill climb for them. However, in the House of Representatives, it seems that Democrats are much more favored to win that chamber, even though it's going to be very, very close.
Yeah, we'll keep a close watch on that. But in the context of the war, Pope Leo, the American Pope, has been weighing in on the conflict, saying Trump's actions were unacceptable when he said Iran's civilization would end. And now the president has hit back again, saying that the Pope is weak on crime and even accusing the pontiff of supporting Iran having nuclear weapons. What's being made of this war of words, if I can call it that, between the president and the head of the Catholic Church?
Well, I think you're going to hear more about it and more reaction later today in the United States. President Trump made those comments late last night following a 60 Minutes report, which talked about the Catholic Church and its stances towards the Trump administration's policies. That seemed to be what President Trump was referring to. And he also, in addition to posting that tweet last night, or the Truth Social, I should say, last night, he also posted an AI-generated image in which he depicts himself, or it appears he's depicting himself as Jesus Christ, something I think a lot of Catholics here in the United States, and there are about 53 million of them here in the United States, have pushed back on and found, in many cases to be offensive. We've seen that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has pushed back on the president's remarks. We know that Pope Leo responded earlier today on the papal plane to Algeria, saying that he was not afraid to, push back on the Trump administration's policies, that he would continue to ramp up or, continue this anti-war rhetoric. But I think the big question is, we're going to see criticism, obviously, from the usual suspects here in the United States, Democrats and other normal critics of President Trump. But it is interesting. The First Lady, Melania Trump, is Roman Catholic. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is Roman Catholic. Vice President J.D. Vance is also Roman Catholic. There is a big contingent of the Roman Catholic population in the United States which votes Republican and which is closely aligned with the Republican Party. So I think there is a big question as to whether we're going to see a further schism or fissure here in the United States among Roman Catholics over this war of words, if you will, between Trump and the Pope.
Yeah, it looks like a new can of worms. And just on one more thing, speaking of J.D. Vance, I wonder what's been made there in Washington of his trip to Hungary, where he effectively campaigned for Viktor Orban, who ultimately lost in a landslide.
Talk about a rough week for J.D. Vance. He campaigned in Hungary last week for Viktor Orban. We saw Orban lost in a landslide, like you said, with very high turnout favoring, the opposition party. However, J.D. Vance also led those talks in Islamabad with the Iranians, and those talks fell through, and there was no deal reached. Obviously, that J.D. Vance was facing insurmountable odds to reach an agreement with Iran, something that in the past, for example, the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration took 2 years to form. J.D. Vance was tasked with doing this in just a number of hours or a few days. So J.D. Vance is certainly, I think, having a rough week here in Washington following those two losses. I think oftentimes historically administrations sort of saddle the vice president with some of these more difficult tasks. But this is seen as a major loss for J.D. Vance and also for the Trump administration. Remember, Orban was one of President Trump's closest allies in Europe. Now they're going to contend with a very different Hungary and, also a shift in Europe, if you will, politically. So that's going to mean big changes for the administration, especially as they're trying to navigate geopolitics in the Iran war. We know that there's been a lot of pushback from European countries, traditional U.S. allies, to the U.S. role in, essentially starting or kicking off the Iran war. So it'll be interesting to see how this election in Hungary impacts those relations.
Yeah, Julia, Manchester, really great to get your insights there from Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you.